Fatal Dispute, the heartbreaking case of Ajike Owens, true crime documentary. Hook. What started as a simple argument between neighbors quickly escalates into a horrifying tragedy. How did a peaceful neighborhood turn into a crime scene? Watch as we unravel the chilling details of the Ajike Owens case, a story of betrayal, survival, and justice. Stay tuned until the end, because the truth behind this shocking crime will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and revenge. Don't miss out on the twists that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The sun was setting when the argument began. The air, heavy with humidity, clung to her skin. Ajike Owens stood at the edge of her yard, looking across at her neighbor's house. The heated exchange was growing louder. Her heart raced, but she stayed calm. Her children, frightened, watched from the doorway, their eyes wide. It had started over something small. A misunderstanding. A simple disagreement that spiraled. The neighbor, an older woman, was angry about the children playing near her yard. Words had been thrown, harsh and bitter. Ajike had tried to reason, but the woman wouldn't listen. "You need to control them," the neighbor had shouted, her face red. "I'm trying," Ajike had said, her voice steady but strained. But that was when things took a turn. The neighbor, frustrated, stormed inside her house. Ajike was confused but didn't think much of it. Her kids tugged at her sleeve, urging her to come inside. The air had thickened, the sky now a deep shade of purple. Then, the sound of something hitting the ground. A thud. Sharp. Unexpected. Ajike froze. Her instincts told her to move, but she couldn't. A few seconds passed. The door to the neighbor's house opened. And then, a flash. Something flew through the air, hurtling towards her. She didn't see it at first, only felt the sudden rush of wind. It hit her hard in the chest. She gasped. The object, a heavy, blunt force, struck her squarely. The shock took her breath away. She staggered back, blinking in confusion. Her children screamed. She couldn't breathe, couldn't understand. Her hand shot to her chest, but nothing was there. Nothing but pain. The neighbor stood there, her expression cold, unmoving. Her eyes locked onto Ajike's. There was no apology. No remorse. Just an icy silence. Ajike's legs buckled. She collapsed, unable to stay upright. The world around her seemed to slow. Her children cried louder, frantic. The world had turned upside down. What had just happened? How had something so small escalated into something so violent? Her vision blurred. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The last thing she remembered was the darkening sky. The heavy weight of the evening pressing down. And then, nothing. The sudden, deafening silence that followed. The world was spinning. Ajike felt a strange weightlessness, as if she were drifting far away. Her body was still there, but it felt distant, foreign. She tried to call out, but no sound came. Her vision blurred and cleared in flashes, quick snapshots of her children crying, hands reaching toward her, desperate. But everything was muffled. Slow. Far off. The neighbor was still standing there. Staring. Not moving. Ajike's breaths grew shallow. A cold sweat slicked across her forehead. Her hand trembled as she reached for the ground. The asphalt was rough beneath her fingers, gritty. She could taste blood in her mouth now, sharp, metallic. The neighbor's door slammed shut, the sound cutting through the haze in her head. It felt final. Like something had ended. Something that could never be undone. Her body felt heavy, the weight of the injury pulling her further down. Her mind raced, but it was clouded with panic. "Mom!" one of her children shouted. Ajike's eyes fluttered open again, but it was hard to focus. The world around her was darkening, fading away. Her children were near her, but their faces were blurry, distorted. Her hand still rested against the rough pavement, but it was growing harder to feel anything. The air smelled like dust and gasoline. A sharp, sickly scent of something burning. Then the rush of footsteps, coming closer. Someone yelling. The door of a car slamming shut. A voice she didn't recognize. Was it a neighbor? A stranger? She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, constricted. The world tilted again, and everything seemed to collapse into blackness. Her thoughts were muddled, broken. The pain was still there, but it was beginning to feel distant too, like everything else. Was she going to die here? In her front yard? A flash of memory, her children laughing, playing just moments ago. Now, everything was wrong. Everything was broken. Then the pressure on her chest shifted. Someone was holding her, lifting her? She couldn't tell. Her body was too weak, her mind too far gone. The pain was still sharp, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. Just the growing sense of dread. Of something horrible lurking in the background. Something no one could undo. The world was dim, distant. Her breathing became shallow, ragged. Faint voices buzzed around her, but they sounded far away, muffled by the pounding in her ears. A coldness spread through her limbs, like ice slowly creeping up her body. Someone was calling her name. Ajike! Can you hear me? The voice was familiar, but distant, as if coming through a tunnel. Her eyelids fluttered, but her eyes didn't want to open. A hand gripped hers, rough, firm, but there was no comfort in it. Her fingers twitched in response, but it felt like it took all her strength. She tried to force her eyes open, to focus, but the darkness was overwhelming. Was she dead? Was this how it ended? Her thoughts felt like they were slipping through her fingers, like sand. The sky above her had turned black, thick clouds gathering. The air was heavy, oppressive. She could hear sirens now, faint but growing louder. But it felt like they were coming from a long way off. Her chest burned, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Stay with me, Ajike! Just stay with me! A new voice. A man's voice. It was urgent. Desperate. She felt herself being lifted, her body rocked back and forth. Hands pulling her up, shaking her. But her limbs wouldn't cooperate. Her head lolled, her vision spinning in slow, agonizing circles. There was something pressing into her chest, hard. Something sharp. Her mind couldn't make sense of it. The neighbor's face flashed in her mind, cold and unmoving. Her eyes, so vacant, so devoid of empathy. Had the woman done this? Had she really? Ajike tried to hold on to the thought, but it slipped away, lost in the haze. The sirens were closer now, but they still felt miles away. The hands on her body felt both comforting and terrifying. Everything was a blur. A nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Stay with me, the voice again, trembling. Her breath was catching, ragged. She felt the pressure on her chest growing tighter, but not in the way it should. Was it a wound? Was she dying? Someone, was pulling at her clothes now. Ripping at her shirt. Tearing at her skin. But why? Her thoughts scattered. Nothing made sense. The world spun, faster now. Faster. Darkness threatened to swallow her whole. Then, suddenly, everything went still. Like the world had paused. A breath. A second. A moment. Everything stopped. In that stillness, Ajike's mind tried to grasp something, anything, but it felt like reaching for shadows. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Her body was limp, but there was something in the air, something heavy. She could feel it on her skin, like the last remnants of a storm. Then, slowly, she became aware of a strange sensation beneath her. Her feet were off the ground. Her body was being moved, but not by her own will. She tried to focus, but her head throbbed. The world tilted again, blurring. Was she dreaming? No. The sirens were louder now, but still, they felt too distant, as if traveling through thick fog. She felt her body jerk suddenly, as if someone had run into her. A sharp jolt. Her eyes fluttered open again, but only for a second. Shapes swam before her, figures moving. Her children? No, they weren't close enough to be holding her. Where were they? Where was everyone? She could hear voices, yelling now. Urgent. Panicked. Then she realized someone was calling out her name again. It was the voice of a man, panicked but firm. Ajike! Stay with me. Hold on. Her eyes snapped open. For a moment, the world was too bright. Too harsh. She squinted against the light, but it hurt. Everything hurt. Her chest ached, as if the weight of the world had pressed down on it. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her throat was dry. Sore. Her lips trembled as she fought for breath. A voice came from somewhere above her. The man again. Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm gonna need you to stay awake. But she could hardly focus on him. The world was spinning again, and her vision flickered. Then shouts. Loud. Close. Her heart skipped a beat. There was a sudden force against her body. The unmistakable pressure of someone kneeling next to her. A hand on her chest. Another on her wrist, checking for a pulse. The sound of harsh breathing. Was that hers? Or was it someone else's? The sirens. Finally, they were here. She heard the screech of tires as a vehicle skidded to a stop near her. Voices yelled. Get the stretcher! Someone shouted her name again, louder now. Ajike tried to blink. She tried to move her lips, but her limbs felt frozen. Her body felt like it wasn't hers anymore. The man's voice was frantic. Stay with me, Ajike. You're gonna be okay. Just stay with me. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. She didn't know if she was ready to believe him. But she couldn't fight anymore. It felt like everything had already slipped away. Like she was already gone. But her body, her chest, still throbbed with that heavy, aching pain. Her fingers twitched again, this time responding to the hand that was holding hers. But the strength, it wasn't her own. It was all she could muster. Then she heard it. A sound that made her heart freeze. A voice, low and distant. Familiar. The voice of the neighbor. The woman who had started all of this. Her words came slowly, drifting through the air. I didn't mean to. It was a whisper, barely audible. But it sent a shockwave through Ajike's broken body. The last shred of clarity she had left snapped. And the darkness swallowed her whole. The world was a blur now. Her thoughts were jagged fragments, scattered like broken glass. Ajike's mind tried to hold on to something, anything, before it slipped into nothingness. But then, that voice. The woman's voice. It echoed in her head, faint but clear. I didn't mean to. Her pulse surged in a sickening rush. Her body tensed, even though she could barely move. What did that mean? Didn't mean to what? Didn't mean to. The pressure in her chest was unbearable now, like something was crushing her heart. The voices around her blurred again, but the distant tone of that whispering confession gnawed at her mind. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, as if trying to grasp something solid, but there was nothing there. No answers. No comfort. The sirens screamed louder, deafening in her ears. Flashes of light from the emergency vehicles painted her face in harsh, flickering reds and blues. Hands were everywhere, tugging at her, moving her, lifting her into something. The smell of antiseptic filled her nose. And then, for a moment, there was silence. Her body stilled. The world outside became a faint hum. She had no idea how much time passed. But slowly, painfully, she began to feel the heaviness lifting from her chest. Someone was talking over her now, speaking in quick, precise tones. Vitals are stable. Pulse is strong, she's breathing. But the words meant nothing. Nothing felt real. Her eyes fluttered open again, but this time it was different. The hospital lights were blinding. Cold. She could hear machines beeping rhythmically, their tones mechanical and sterile. She could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, distant but clear. But the world still felt far away. There was a sharp tug in her chest, a need to focus, to make sense of the situation, but everything felt out of reach. Her body seemed disconnected from her mind, floating in a space where nothing was quite as it should be. She turned her head slightly, her body screaming in protest, but there was a fleeting moment of clarity. A figure beside her. A nurse, or maybe a doctor. But then, the voice again. The woman's voice. The neighbor. I didn't mean to. The words were like a ghost, haunting the edges of her consciousness. Ajike's eyes snapped open wider. Her breath hitched. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't have been. A wave of dread washed over her, pushing her deeper into the darkness. It had never been just words. It had been something more. Something darker. Something that had crossed a line. The silence in the room deepened, thick with tension, but Ajike could feel it, the pull, the weight of what was coming. What she had to face. What she had to remember. And then, a sharp chill ran down her spine. The truth was coming. And she was terrified of it. The cold in the room pressed in on her, suffocating. Ajike could feel it creeping through her limbs, deep into her bones. It wasn't just the chill of the hospital air. It was something else. Something darker. She tried to focus, tried to make sense of it. The woman's voice, still lingering, still echoing in her mind. I didn't mean to. Her heart raced again, a frantic pulse beating through her chest. But it wasn't just fear. It was something worse. Something familiar. She could almost see it now, through the haze. The woman's face, the neighbor's face, was imprinted in her mind. Cold. Empty. Like the eyes of a predator. A shiver ran through her. She turned her head toward the sound of footsteps, hoping to break the hold of that memory. But then, she caught something else. A figure in the hallway, standing just out of sight. The silhouette seemed to linger, just watching. Her breath caught in her throat. Had someone seen her? Had someone heard her? Her mind struggled to put the pieces together, but they kept slipping away, like water through her fingers. The figure in the hallway moved then, stepping out of the shadows. It wasn't a nurse, nor a doctor. It was her neighbor. The woman. She stood there, just inside the door, her eyes dark, unreadable. Ajike's pulse quickened, but she couldn't speak. Couldn't move. She felt as though the room was closing in on her, tightening around her chest. The neighbor didn't say a word. She just stood there. And it wasn't just the fear of what had happened. It was something else. Something unspoken. The air grew thick with tension. The walls felt like they were closing in. And then, the neighbor spoke again. Softly. Barely a whisper. I'm sorry, you didn't deserve this. The words hit like a hammer, shattering the fragile calm that had taken over the room. Ajike's body stiffened. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was real. It wasn't an accident. The confession hung in the air between them. But even now, there was no remorse in the woman's voice. No sign of guilt. Just that cold, empty tone. She was waiting for something. Waiting for Ajike to react. To scream. To beg. But Ajike couldn't. The shock had stripped her of everything. Her strength. Her will. It was like a weight had been placed on her chest, and she couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Just feel. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of what had happened. Her mind raced. How had it come to this? How had this argument turned into something so lethal? And yet, the truth was right there. She could feel it in her bones. The neighbor's face remained impassive, her eyes cold, empty. She didn't seem afraid. She didn't seem sorry. Just waiting. For Ajike to break. But Ajike couldn't. She couldn't break. Not yet. She still had questions. So many questions. And the answers were buried somewhere, deep in the place where fear and rage collided. Ajike's eyes never left the neighbor's face. That cold, distant face. The woman stood at the door, motionless. Her expression was unreadable, like a mask that hid everything except something darker. Something hidden beneath. Ajike could feel the tension thick in the room, like the air was solid, pressing in on her from all sides. Her chest tightened with every breath. She wanted to scream. To demand answers. But the words wouldn't come. She could only stare at the woman, her mind grappling with the fragments of memories and emotions crashing together in a storm. "I'm sorry." The neighbor's voice came again, low, almost remorseful. But Ajike heard the lie beneath it. She could feel it in her gut. The woman wasn't sorry. She wasn't sorry at all. "You did this." Ajike's voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. Her lips trembled, but she had to say it. She had to. Her throat burned, but the words forced their way out. "You hurt me. You hurt my children." The neighbor's eyes flickered for the first time, just a tiny shift. Ajike could see it now. The briefest flash of guilt, maybe. Or was it fear? Was the woman afraid of something? Of being caught? "Ajike, please," the neighbor said, her voice shaking now, just a little. "I didn't. I never meant for it to go this far." Ajike wanted to lunge at her. To scream at her. To make her feel the pain that had been inflicted on her family. But she couldn't move. She couldn't do anything. The weight of it all was crushing her. "You didn't mean to?" Ajike croaked. "Didn't mean to? You threw something at me. You." Her mind flashed to the moment. The moment when it all went wrong. The object hurtling through the air. The coldness in the woman's eyes. The silence that followed. "I thought it was just a warning," the woman murmured, her voice trembling now, revealing something she hadn't wanted to show. "I didn't want to. I never thought." Ajike's blood ran cold. "A warning?" The words hit her like a slap. "You thought, a warning? A warning for what?" Ajike's chest tightened even more. "For me to keep my children away from your yard?" The neighbors shifted uneasily, but she didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to Ajike. The silence stretched again. It wasn't just the object. The rock. The blunt force. It was something much deeper. Something about the woman. Something that had been festering beneath the surface. Ajike could feel the truth clawing at the edges of her thoughts, but it was still too far to grasp. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. She couldn't even lift her hand without a sharp, shooting pain. But she had to know. She had to ask. "Why?" Ajike finally managed, her voice breaking through the thick tension. "Why did you do this?" The neighbor stared at her for a long moment, her face twisted in some unspoken emotion. Then, just as Ajike was about to demand again, the woman spoke. "I didn't want to be afraid anymore." The words were soft, but they sent a chill down Ajike's spine. "I didn't want you in my space. I didn't want your kids to be around making noise. I was tired of it. Tired of feeling like I had no control." Ajike blinked, disbelief flooding her. Was she hearing this correctly? "Control?" she repeated. "You hurt me, because of control?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, looking at the floor, her hands wringing in front of her. Then she nodded, but it wasn't a nod of apology. It was one of acceptance. The truth hung heavy in the air, thickening with every second. Ajike's heart raced, her breath coming in uneven gasps. The anger inside her was building, rising like a tide. The sheer audacity. The cruelty. And yet, the woman had no remorse. She wasn't sorry. And in that moment, Ajike understood. It was never about her. It had never been about her or her children. It had been about something inside the neighbor. Something darker. Something twisted. And no matter how much Ajike wanted answers, no matter how much she wanted to understand, there would be no satisfaction. No closure. Just the cold, stark reality that her life had been shattered by someone who simply wanted to control. To break. And now, all Ajike could do was survive. And somehow, live with the truth. The truth that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence between them stretched like an abyss. Ajike felt the weight of it. The weight of the words she had just heard. The neighbor's confession, so calm, so cold, clung to her like a shroud. She wanted to scream. To lash out. But her body was too weak. Too broken. The anger burned inside her, but there was nowhere to direct it. Nowhere to put it. She could feel the tremor in her hands, the pounding in her chest. Control. Ajike whispered again, barely able to comprehend it. You hurt me, for control? The woman's eyes flickered, but she didn't answer. It was as if she was waiting for Ajike to understand. To process. But how could she? How could anyone? Do you even understand what you've done? Ajike's voice cracked, the words pushing through her throat with an effort. The neighbor didn't look ashamed. She didn't look regretful. She just stood there, waiting. Waiting for Ajike to react. To collapse into the truth. But all Ajike could feel was this overwhelming surge of disbelief. Disbelief that something so senseless, so small, could spiral into something so monstrous. I didn't mean for it to go this far, the woman said again, her voice trembling, but still empty. I couldn't stand the noise. The kids, always laughing, always shouting. It drove me crazy. Ajike could barely comprehend the words. Her head felt heavy, her mind too numb to fully grasp the horror of it. Everything about this felt wrong. The house. The neighborhood. The woman standing before her, speaking as if what she'd done could somehow be justified. Ajike wanted to scream. She wanted to tear it all down, expose the truth for what it was. But there was a dark understanding creeping over her, too. She wasn't going to get justice. Not from this woman. Not from the world around her. The systems would protect her, just as they always protected the ones who weren't truly sorry. The neighbors, the ones who had witnessed the argument, who had seen her struggle, wouldn't speak out. They never did. Ajike realized then that the world didn't always work the way it should. It didn't give second chances. It didn't offer peace. There was no clean resolution. No clean ending. You hurt me, Ajike said, her voice quieter now, as she turned her gaze back to the ceiling, the sterile hospital lights blinding in their starkness. You threw that rock at me. You threw that rock at my heart. The woman's face twitched, her eyes finally betraying something, a brief flicker of guilt. But it was fleeting. Gone. Maybe I did, the neighbor muttered, almost to herself, her voice small, almost pleading. But you'll never understand how it feels, living in that house, surrounded by noise, by things I can't control. It's all I had left. It was all I had to hold on to. Ajike's breath caught in her throat. There it was. The twisted justification. The warped logic that had driven the woman to this point. A house. A yard. Noise. Nothing of real substance. Nothing that could ever outweigh what had been done. And yet, she'd acted like it was. Ajike closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tears fall freely now. She couldn't stop them. She was tired. Tired of the fight. Tired of the pain. Tired of a world that allowed this kind of thing to happen. But the truth was, she wasn't done yet. She still had something left. Somewhere, buried deep under the hurt, under the shock, under the layers of betrayal. She had the will to live. She had the strength to fight, even if it was just for herself. The woman had taken everything, her peace, her safety, her dignity, but Ajike was still here. And that, for now, would have to be enough. Ajike's eyes met the woman's once more, and she saw it then. Fear. Not just of the truth, but of the consequences. The weight of what had been done had begun to settle in. Ajike wasn't going to forget. No one would forget. And maybe, just maybe, that was the one thing the neighbor had never counted on. The moment the truth was out, it would never go away. And neither would Ajike. Not now. Not ever. The hospital room felt colder now. The truth was hanging thick in the air, suffocating everything around them. Ajike's chest still ached, a dull, unrelenting pain that seemed to merge with the weight of the betrayal. The neighbor hadn't moved. She just stood there, her face pale, her hands twisted nervously in front of her. Ajike could feel the coldness of her presence, like a shadow that stretched across the room. But now, it wasn't just fear in the neighbor's eyes. There was something else there. Regret. It wasn't genuine, though. Not yet. It was a flicker, a brief, fleeting thing. Ajike could see it. But it was too late. The woman had crossed the line, and no amount of regret could undo the damage. Ajike's gaze never left her, eyes sharp, piercing. "Do you think this will just disappear?" Ajike's voice broke through the thick silence, barely a whisper, but carrying all the weight of what had happened. The neighbor's eyes shifted, looking down at her feet. The truth had already settled between them. There was no going back now. Ajike shifted slightly in the bed, her limbs still sore, still stiff from the trauma. But her voice, her presence, felt stronger now. Like the first real breath after suffocating underwater. "You didn't just hurt me," Ajike continued, the words gaining momentum. "You hurt my children. You hurt my family. You thought you could control us. Silence us. But you were wrong." The woman opened her mouth to say something, but Ajike cut her off, her voice suddenly louder. "No more lies. No more excuses. I'm not your scapegoat. And neither are my children." The neighbor's lips trembled, but she stayed silent. She couldn't argue against it anymore. Ajike had seen through her. The thin veil of justification had been torn away, and now, all that was left was the raw, ugly truth. The woman had never cared. Not about Ajike. Not about her children. She cared only for herself. Only for the illusion of control. And now, in this moment, Ajike could see it. The woman was afraid. Not of Ajike. Not of what had happened. But of what was coming. Of the consequences that were inevitable. Ajike's voice dropped again, steady and sure. "You're going to have to face this. You're going to have to pay for what you've done." For the first time since the moment she collapsed outside, Ajike felt a flicker of something close to power. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She wasn't just someone who had been hurt. She was the one who was standing. The one who was still breathing. And that, in itself, was a form of resistance. The woman's face paled further. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Ajike could see the cracks forming in the facade. She could see the fear in her eyes now. She wasn't in control anymore. And it was terrifying. It was terrifying to know that the power the neighbor had once wielded, over her family, was now slipping away. Ajike couldn't bring back the moments that had been stolen from her, but she could ensure this woman didn't walk away unscathed. "Don't come near me again," Ajike said, her voice low but clear. "And don't think you can hide from this. You can't run. Not anymore." The woman's face twisted, her hands shaking now as she finally took a step back. Ajike watched her go, not with relief, but with resolve. This wasn't over. It wasn't close to over. But it was the beginning of something new. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Control. The one thing the neighbor had wanted so badly. And the one thing Ajike had just taken back. The woman disappeared from the doorway, her retreating footsteps echoing in the distance. And as the door clicked shut behind her, Ajike closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how much of her life would be torn apart by this, by everything that had happened. But she knew this. She would face it. She would face everything. And in the end, she would be the one standing. Not broken. Not defeated. But whole. Strong. Survivor. And that was the one thing the neighbor could never take away from her. Not now. Not ever. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Ajike's breathing was shallow, the weight of the moment pressing in on her. But beneath that, there was something new. Something unfamiliar. A sense of clarity. She wasn't sure how long she stayed there, staring at the empty doorway, but it felt like time had both slowed and sped up all at once. The hospital room seemed to stretch in all directions, the walls closing in on her, only to pull back again, leaving her floating in this strange, suspended reality. The echoes of the woman's confession, her twisted justification, still reverberated in her mind, but Ajike was no longer listening. She had heard enough. It was done. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She wasn't going to be defined by what had happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a spark of something that resembled hope. The battle ahead would be long. The road to recovery, physically, mentally, would be harder than anything she'd ever faced. But it would be hers to walk. No one else would have the power to dictate her journey. Ajike inhaled deeply, the sterile scent of the hospital air filling her lungs. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors beside her now felt strangely reassuring, like a heartbeat, steady, unyielding. And in that beat, she found herself again. Her body ached with every breath, but she could handle it. She would handle it. The light from the hallway poured through the small window in her room, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor, filling the space with an almost ghostly glow. She couldn't stay here forever. She knew that. But she had to rebuild. Not just her life, but her sense of self. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. She closed her eyes again, letting the tears fall silently, one by one. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for the life that had been torn apart. For the innocence lost. For the children, who had been caught in the crossfire of a battle they hadn't even known existed. But even through the tears, there was something stronger. A quiet fire, burning deep in her chest. A resolve that had been forged in the heat of her pain. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, she felt a presence. A soft, tentative knock on the door. Ajike turned her head slowly, surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone. Not now. Not yet. But when the door opened, it wasn't the nurse or the doctor. It was her son. His face was pale, his eyes wide with uncertainty, but there was something in his stance, something in his gaze, that told her everything she needed to know. He was scared. But he was strong. "Mom?" His voice cracked, but it was steady. "Are you okay?" For a moment, Ajike couldn't answer. She just stared at him, the weight of everything they had both endured hanging in the air between them. Her heart ached for him. For everything he had lost. For the trauma he had carried in silence. But then, something in her snapped into place. Her son needed her. He needed her to be strong. She couldn't let him down. She couldn't let herself down. Ajike lifted her hand, a small, shaky gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "Come here, baby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for only a second before crossing the room, his feet light, almost hesitant, until he was standing by her side. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she gently pulled him into an embrace. He stiffened for a moment, unsure, but then relaxed into her arms, his small frame pressing against her with a quiet sob. It wasn't a sob of despair. It was a release. A release of everything they had been holding inside. And as they stood there, in that quiet, sterile room, Ajike felt a rush of something that felt like peace. It wasn't everything. It wasn't all fixed. But it was the first step. And that was enough. For now. Her son lifted his head slightly, his face streaked with tears, but his eyes no longer held that same fear. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, the words choked with emotion. "I should have." "Shh," Ajike interrupted gently, pulling him closer. "It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." She kissed the top of his head, smoothing his hair back gently. "I'm going to be okay," she murmured. "We're going to be okay." For the first time since everything had fallen apart, Ajike felt something close to certainty. It was a quiet, fragile thing. But it was there. The road ahead would be long. It would be painful. But she wasn't walking it alone. And in the end, that was all that mattered. They would rebuild, piece by piece, together. And no one, could take that away from them. Ajike held her son tightly, as though she could pull all the broken pieces of their lives together in that single embrace. The rhythm of his shallow breaths, the warmth of his small body pressed against hers, steadied her. The world outside was still the same, chaotic, unforgiving, uncertain. But in this moment, in this space between the sterile hospital sheets and the dim light of the room, they were safe. At least for now. Her mind replayed the events, each fragment crashing into the next with brutal clarity. The argument. The rock. the panic that had exploded into violence. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was what she had left. Her son. Her family. Herself. And as much as the pain of what had happened threatened to swallow her whole, there was something else she couldn't ignore. The anger. The simmering rage that had been buried deep, pushing its way to the surface. It would be so easy to let it consume her. To let it tear her apart until all that was left was the shadow of who she had been. But she couldn't. Not now. She wasn't alone anymore. She pulled back slightly, enough to see her son's face. His eyes, still wide with worry, searched hers for any sign that everything might be okay. She didn't have all the answers. She wasn't even sure what the next step was. But she could be strong for him. For them both. "We'll get through this," Ajike whispered, the words rough and raw, but true. "I promise." Her son nodded, but his expression remained guarded. It wasn't just fear she saw in him now. It was a heavy burden, one that no child should ever have to carry. He was stronger than most adults she knew, but even strength had its limits. "Mom," he began, his voice small but determined. "I don't want you to be scared anymore. I don't want you to be hurt." Ajike swallowed the lump in her throat, tears welling in her eyes once more. She pulled him in close again, resting her cheek against the top of his head, unable to say anything for a long moment. But she didn't need to say anything. His words had been enough. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him, for her children, for the family that had been shattered. And no matter what, she wasn't going to let this broken world swallow them whole. She finally pulled back, looking him in the eyes. "We'll be okay," she repeated, her voice steady now, even as the weight of the truth settled deeper in her chest. "We'll fight for each other." The door creaked softly again, breaking the fragile moment between them. A nurse appeared, her face filled with concern. "You're not supposed to have visitors yet," the nurse said gently, though there was no reprimand in her tone. Ajike nodded, squeezing her son's hand one last time before letting go. "I know," she said quietly. "But it's okay. He's family." The nurse gave a soft, understanding smile, nodding before stepping back to give them some space. Ajike turned her gaze back to her son, whose eyes were now filled with a mixture of hope and weariness. He needed reassurance, she realized. He needed to know that, despite everything that had happened, there was still a path forward. And she would be the one to help him find it. "I'll be all right," Ajike said again, her voice firm now. "I'll make sure of it." Her son nodded slowly, though she could see the hesitance still lingering in his eyes. But they would get through this. They had to. "Come here," she said softly, gesturing for him to sit by her side once more. He hesitated for only a moment before climbing onto the edge of the bed. Ajike reached out, taking his hand, squeezing it. The nurse moved toward the door, preparing to leave them alone again. As she stepped back into the hallway, Ajike could feel the weight of her son's presence beside her, solid and unwavering. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ajike realized something. There were no quick fixes. No magic words to make everything better. But there was strength in survival. Strength in enduring. And there was power in standing together. Her journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But she was no longer a passive observer in her own life. She was fighting. She was alive. And no matter what came next, she would fight until the very end. For herself. For her children. For everything that was worth saving. She would rise. Ajike sat there, holding her son's hand, feeling the steady beat of his pulse beneath her fingers. The room was quiet now, save for the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant murmur of voices outside the door. But inside, it felt like a battlefield. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, memories of that day, the terrifying confrontation with the neighbor, the crash of the rock against her chest. The moment her body hit the ground, the sharp sting of pain, the frantic scramble to protect her children. Her children. The thought of them sent a fresh wave of anguish through her, but it also fueled something else. A burning desire to protect them from the ugliness of the world. from the darkness that had tried to swallow them whole. She squeezed her son's hand tighter, a silent promise passing between them. No more fear. No more silence. I'll be okay, Ajike whispered again, the words a mantra she had to believe. She had to. We'll get through this together. Her son nodded, his eyes softening, but she could see the weight in them, the weight of everything that had happened. The fear. The confusion. He was too young to understand the full scope of the violence they had endured, but it was in his eyes. It was there, waiting to break free. Ajike knew she couldn't shelter him forever. She couldn't hide him away from the pain and the harshness of life. But she could guide him. She could be the anchor in this storm. The door to her room creaked again, and this time, Ajike's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a nurse. This was someone else. She turned, bracing herself for whatever would come next, but what she saw sent a wave of unexpected relief through her chest. It was her mother. Ajike's breath caught in her throat. Her mother's face was worn, aged by worry and grief, but her eyes, the eyes that had always been a safe harbor for Ajike, were filled with something that had been missing for so long. Love. Unconditional love. Her mother moved toward her slowly, the quiet shuffle of her footsteps a small comfort in the otherwise tense room. Mom! Ajike whispered, her voice breaking, the flood of emotions too much to hold back. Her mother didn't say anything at first. She simply reached out, pulling Ajike into her arms with a gentleness that made the world outside disappear. Shh! Her mother murmured, her voice soft, soothing. It's okay, baby. You're safe now. Ajike closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her mother's embrace seep into her bones. It was the kind of comfort she hadn't realized she needed so badly, the kind that filled the empty places in her heart. But even in that moment, Ajike could feel the heaviness of the world outside pressing in. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She pulled away from her mother slowly, wiping the tears from her face as she met her gaze. Her mother's eyes were filled with both concern and something else, a quiet resolve that mirrored her own. Ajike, listen to me, her mother said softly. You're strong. You've always been strong. And we'll get through this. But you can't do it alone. You don't have to. Ajike looked down at her hands, fingers trembling slightly. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in. How much she had been trying to shoulder on her own. Her mother was right. She couldn't do this alone. She had always been a fighter. Always fought to protect her family, her children. But this was different. The hurt was deeper. The wounds were darker. She couldn't heal herself alone. I know, Mom, Ajike whispered, her voice catching again. I know. Her mother nodded, brushing a strand of hair from Ajike's forehead. You've got us, baby. You've always had us. Ajike's heart twisted at the simple words, the reassurance she had desperately needed but hadn't known how to ask for. Her mother was right. She didn't have to fight this battle alone. Her family was here. Her children. Her mother. They were the ones who would help her rise from this, piece by piece. She wouldn't let the darkness take them down. Not now. Not ever. Suddenly, the room felt a little less cold. A little less suffocating. Thank you, Mom, Ajike said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Her mother smiled, though there was a deep sadness in her eyes. We'll take it one day at a time. Ajike nodded, but she could feel it, this weight lifting, just a little. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. But she had a new strength now. A new resolve. Together they would fight. Together they would rebuild. And no matter what happened next, Ajike knew one thing for sure. The future would be theirs. They would take it back piece by piece. One step at a time. Ajike leaned back against her pillow, the weight of her mother's presence a steady anchor in the storm. Her chest still ached, both physically and emotionally, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she had a glimmer of peace. A brief, fleeting sense of safety. Her mother's hands rested gently on her shoulders, a comforting pressure, as though reminding her that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. But even with her mother's love and support, Ajike knew the road ahead would be long. The journey to recovery, mentally, physically, emotionally, would stretch far beyond the hospital walls. The worst was over, yes. The immediate danger had passed. But the aftermath? That was another story. Her thoughts returned to the neighbor, the woman whose name she barely remembered now. Her coldness, her twisted justification for what had happened, it still made Ajike's blood boil. Her chest tightened again as she thought of her children. They had been forced to grow up too quickly, to witness things no child should ever have to see. It wasn't just the rock. It wasn't just the injury. It was the fear. The uncertainty. The way their world had been turned upside down in an instant. But Ajike wouldn't let it break them. She would rebuild their lives. She would show her children that no matter how deep the wounds, no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always a way to rise again. Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts, soft and steady. "Have you thought about what happens next, baby? About going home?" Ajike blinked, the question pulling her back to the present. Her eyes flickered toward the window, where the dull light of day was beginning to fade into evening. Home. The word still felt foreign. She could feel it in her bones, the weight of the house. The walls. The rooms that had once been filled with laughter, now haunted by the ghosts of everything that had happened. She wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. But she couldn't stay in this sterile hospital room forever. She had to face the world outside. She had to find a way back. "I don't know," Ajike replied, her voice soft, almost lost in the space between them. "It feels different now." Her mother gave a small, understanding nod. "Of course it does. It's going to take time. But you're strong. We'll help you. We'll go through this together, step by step." Ajike managed a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She wasn't sure when it would be okay again. She wasn't sure when the pieces of her life would finally come back together. But one thing was certain. She couldn't do it alone. The hospital door opened again, this time with more urgency. A nurse, her face tight with concern, stepped into the room, her eyes flicking briefly to Ajike's mother before landing on Ajike. "Mrs. Owens," the nurse began, her voice low but serious. "We need to talk." Ajike's stomach churned at the sound of her name, as though the nurse's words were already carrying a weight she wasn't ready for. She glanced at her mother, whose expression instantly shifted, going from calm to cautious. "What is it?" Ajike asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with whatever news she had to deliver. After a moment, she stepped forward, lowering her voice. "There's been an update on your case. The police have been investigating the incident with your neighbor, and, well, there's something you need to know." Ajike's pulse quickened, her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but nothing could have prepared her for the words that followed. "We've just been informed that your neighbor has been arrested." Ajike blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. "Arrested?" she repeated, almost to herself. "Yes," the nurse confirmed, her voice steady but carrying the weight of what she was about to say. "The police are charging her with assault and attempted murder. They believe she threw that rock with the intent to cause serious harm." The words felt distant, unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's story. Ajike's stomach churned again, nausea rising in her throat. Her neighbor. The woman who had stood in front of her just hours ago, so calm, so detached. The woman who had admitted, without a hint of remorse, to the violence she had inflicted. And now, she was facing the consequences. Ajike's eyes flickered to her mother, who was watching her closely, her face drawn with concern. There was no victory in this. No satisfaction in the knowledge that the woman who had hurt her would now face justice. There was only exhaustion. And a deep, gnawing sense of unease. "She's going to pay for what she did," Ajike murmured, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The nurse gave a small nod. "The investigation is still ongoing. But rest assured, the authorities are taking this seriously. They'll make sure she's held accountable." Ajike closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the flood of emotions crashing over her. There were no easy answers. No simple solutions. Just the harsh reality that she was living in now. The road ahead would be filled with questions, with uncertainty. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The journey to healing, emotionally, legally, and physically, was just beginning. But for the first time, Ajike felt a flicker of something deep inside her. Hope. The smallest spark. And that was enough to keep her going. For now. Ajike sat back, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed, the news sinking in like a stone in her chest. Her neighbor, the woman who had caused so much pain, who had shattered the peace of her life, was facing serious charges. Assault. Attempted murder. It should have brought relief. But it didn't. It only brought more questions. More confusion. How could someone be so cruel? So cold? How could she have looked into Ajike's eyes and seen nothing but a target? The nurse gave a final nod, the weight of her words hanging in the air before she quietly retreated from the room, leaving mother and daughter to absorb everything in silence. Ajike glanced at her mother, whose face was etched with concern but also something else, something familiar. A quiet strength that Ajike had always relied on. Her mother wasn't saying anything. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes. Ajike looked down at her hands. Her fingers, still trembling slightly from the shock, dug into the soft fabric of the hospital sheets. The pain in her chest hadn't gone away, it hadn't even lessened, but it felt different now. Less like something inside her that was breaking, and more like something that was being forced open. "You okay, Mom?" Ajike asked, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. Her mother's gaze softened as she reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind Ajike's ear. "I'm here, baby," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Ajike nodded, closing her eyes for a moment. Her mother's words were like a bomb, but they couldn't erase the ache inside her. They couldn't change what had happened. And still, Ajike felt something stir within her. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, or the deep, raw ache of everything she had just learned, but something inside her was shifting. Something had been broken open. A door. A window. A chance. She was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She was a fighter. And she wasn't about to let it all slip away now. "I don't know if I can ever really forgive her," Ajike whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The words were like acid, burning as they left her mouth. Her mother didn't respond immediately. She simply placed a hand on Ajike's, her touch firm, grounding. "Forgiveness doesn't mean letting them off the hook," her mother said, her voice quiet but resolute. "It means freeing yourself from the weight of their actions. It means you stop letting them have control over you." Ajike stared at her mother, letting the words sink in. Freeing herself. The thought was almost foreign. How could she free herself when the trauma was still so fresh, so raw? How could she let go of the anger that still simmered in her veins, burning every thought, every moment? But her mother was right. Holding on to that anger, holding on to the hatred, the fear, the pain, only gave the woman power. She didn't need that anymore. Ajike clenched her fists, taking a deep breath. She wouldn't let the past define her. She wouldn't let her neighbor's cruelty destroy the woman she had worked so hard to become. But forgiveness? That would take time. And that was okay. The room grew quieter, the hum of the hospital equipment filling the space between them. Ajike's mind was spinning, but she was beginning to see things more clearly. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't walking it alone anymore. Her mother would be by her side. And her children? They needed her. She needed them. This was about healing now. Not just for her, but for all of them. "I'll do whatever it takes," Ajike said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll fight for us. For our family." Her mother smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You already are, baby. You already are." The door opened again, and Ajike looked up, expecting the nurse or another doctor. But this time, it was her son, stepping into the room with cautious steps, his face drawn with worry. His small hands were tucked in the pockets of his hoodie, and his eyes searched hers, uncertain. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" Ajike felt her heart swell, a rush of love and protectiveness flooding her chest. Her son. Her beautiful, strong boy. He had seen too much already. Experienced more than he should have. But he was here now. He was alive. And so was she. "I'm okay," Ajike said, her voice firm now, even if her heart was still heavy. "We're going to be okay." Her son hesitated for a moment, his eyes lingering on her face, trying to read her expression. And then, without warning, he crossed the room and climbed up onto the bed next to her, curling into her side like he had when he was younger. She wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. There were no words left. Only the warmth of each other's presence, the promise of better days ahead. The weight of everything they had endured still pressed down on her, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt like something she could bear. Something they could bear together. And in the quiet of that hospital room, with the soft breath of her son beside her, Ajike knew something deep in her soul. They were going to rise from this. They were going to heal. And no one, not her neighbor, not the darkness of the past, could take that away from them. They had already survived. Now it was time to live. Ajike held her son close, feeling the warmth of his small body pressed against hers, the rhythm of his heartbeats slowing her own. The quiet of the room enveloped them, a rare stillness in the chaos that had dominated their lives for what felt like forever. But something had shifted in her. The broken pieces of her heart had started to stitch themselves together, slowly but surely. It wasn't a perfect fix. It never would be. But it was something. And for the first time in a long while, it was enough. Her son shifted slightly, looking up at her with those big, searching eyes. "Mom," he whispered again, his voice still fragile. "Are you sure?" She pulled him closer, her chin resting on his head, feeling his soft hair against her cheek. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady now. She stroked his back, the gesture simple but filled with all the love she could muster. "We're going to be okay. I promise." It wasn't just about the bruises and cuts that marked her body. It wasn't just about the trauma that had nearly ripped their world apart. It was about finding the strength to keep going. To find the spark of light that would lead them out of the darkness. The hospital room felt like a temporary refuge, a place where they could rest, catch their breath, and figure out what came next. But Ajike knew that once they left, they would be walking into a world full of unknowns. The police had their investigation. The courts would eventually follow. But what would it all mean for her family? What would it mean for her children, who had seen things no child should ever have to witness? She didn't have the answers. Not yet. But she had hope. Hope that, in time, they could rebuild. "Are we going home soon?" her son asked, his voice still small, as though he was afraid that even asking might make it all disappear. Ajike smiled softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Yes, baby. Soon." She could feel the exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. The physical wounds would heal in time, but the emotional scars would take longer. Much longer. Her mother had left to speak with the doctors, but Ajike could still hear her voice echoing in her mind, reminding her that they didn't have to do this alone. She wasn't alone anymore. Not with her children, not with the love and support of the family that had surrounded her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. No one could guarantee that. But it would be a road they would walk together. Ajike took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the room fill her lungs. Her eyes closed for a moment, trying to push away the lingering doubt that gnawed at her. The door creaked open again, and Ajike's heart skipped in her chest. Another nurse. Another doctor. Another reminder that the outside world was still waiting. But it wasn't what she expected. It was the police. 2 officers stepped into the room, their faces unreadable, professional. They were here to speak with her. To follow up on the case. The tension in the room shifted. Her son's body tensed beside her, his fingers curling tighter around her hand, as though sensing the gravity of the moment. Ajike didn't move at first. She felt the weight of their presence like a physical force. The silence between them was thick. One of the officers, a tall man with dark hair and a serious expression, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Owens," he began, his voice low but firm. "We know this isn't easy. But we need to ask you some questions about what happened that day." Ajike nodded slowly, feeling the muscles in her shoulders tense. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, if she was ready to relive that moment again, but she knew it was part of the process. Part of moving forward. Her son looked up at her, his face worried. She gave him a reassuring smile, though it felt weak and fragile. "I'm listening," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer glanced at his partner, a woman with short, cropped hair, before speaking again. "We need to get your statement. The details of the altercation, what led up to the incident, everything." Ajike swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew this moment was inevitable. She had to face it. She had to find the strength to speak about the nightmare that had unfolded in front of her children. But as the words formed in her mind, something deep inside her resisted. The terror, the helplessness, the betrayal she felt when that rock was thrown, it all rushed back in a wave. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. "I don't want to remember it," she whispered, more to herself than to the officers. "I don't want to relive it." The officers exchanged a look, but the woman spoke gently. "I understand, Mrs. Owens. But the more we know, the better we can help you." Ajike looked down at her son, who was still clinging to her, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. She could feel his fear, his uncertainty, and it nearly broke her. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for him. For her children. "I'll tell you what happened," she said, her voice stronger now. "It was the beginning of something new. Something terrifying, but necessary." Her heart pounded as she began to recount the events of that day, her confrontation with the neighbor, the terrifying moment the rock was thrown, the chaos that followed. Each word was like pulling a splinter from deep within her, the pain lingering even as the words left her mouth. But when she was done, when she had spoken all she could, the silence was different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was a release. The officers nodded, taking notes. "Thank you, Mrs. Owens. You've been very cooperative." Ajike nodded, still holding her son close. She had done it. She had said it. And though it hurt more than she had expected, it felt like a small step forward. One step toward healing. One step closer to reclaiming their lives. The officers left, the room quiet again. But Ajike knew, deep in her bones, that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The beginning of the long road back to normalcy. The road where they would heal, grow, and learn to live without fear. And she would lead them down that path. Weeks had passed since Ajike had given her statement. The hospital room, the police, the investigation, it all felt like distant memories now, swallowed by the busy pace of daily life. But still, the weight of what had happened lingered, pressing down on her like an invisible hand. She had been home for a few days now, the air thick with the scent of her mother's cooking and the soft hum of her children's voices. The walls of their house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Every corner held a memory of that day. The sound of the rock crashing against her chest. The fear in her children's eyes. The helplessness that had nearly broken her. But she was no longer the woman who had fallen to the ground that afternoon. She wasn't the woman who had looked into the eyes of her neighbor and seen nothing but cruelty. She was someone different now. Her body had healed, though the bruises on her soul remained. The scars were still there, hidden beneath layers of strength and resilience. But each day she grew stronger. Each day, she took back a little more of herself. The house had become a place of quiet recovery, a place where laughter still echoed, despite everything that had happened. Her children had started to return to their routines, school, playdates, moments of joy that Ajike hadn't thought possible just weeks before. They were healing, too. And the neighbor? The woman who had thrown the rock, who had almost taken everything from her, she was still facing the consequences of her actions. The legal battle was long drawn out, but the truth was on their side. Ajike had done what she needed to do. She had fought back, not with violence, but with the power of her voice. The road ahead was still uncertain. The legal system was slow, and there were still days when Ajike couldn't shake the fear of running into that woman again. But in the silence of her home, surrounded by her family, Ajike had found something that no one could take away. Peace. She had survived. And in surviving, she had found her strength, not just for herself, but for her children. They had a future now. A future where fear no longer controlled their every move. Ajike took a deep breath, watching the sunset filter through the window. It was a new day. A new beginning. And for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. Her family was whole. And together they would move forward. No matter what. The days slowly drifted by, the seasons shifting as they always did. Yet, for Ajike, time had begun to feel different. The chaotic rush of recovery, of police reports, legal battles, and hospital visits, had settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. Life was no longer defined by the aftermath of that terrible day. She had found something else. It was in the quiet moments at home. The way her children's laughter echoed through the house again, the soft hum of life that had returned, even if it was a bit shakier than before. Her son had stopped waking up from nightmares. Her daughter, once so withdrawn, now spoke more freely, her voice bright and full of hope. There were still moments when the darkness crept in, when Ajike would wake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, the sound of the rock crashing against her chest echoing in her mind. But those moments were fewer now, fading slowly, like a bad dream you can't quite remember. She'd seen the neighbor once, in passing. The woman had been walking out of her front door when their eyes met across the yard. But the look Ajike gave her, steady, unflinching, was one the neighbor hadn't expected. There was no anger in her gaze. No desire for revenge. Ajike had forgiven her, in a way. But forgiveness was not for the neighbor, it was for herself. For her own peace. For the chance to finally let go of the bitterness that had once threatened to consume her. The trial would come, the legal battle would unfold. But Ajike no longer held on to the hope of justice the way she once had. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming her life. And that, she knew, was something no one could take from her. The sun set, casting a soft, golden glow through the window. Ajike stood there, watching the colors shift across the sky. It felt like a sign. A promise of something more, something good, waiting for her and her children just beyond the horizon. She was whole again. And no matter what happened next, she had already conquered the hardest part. Life, she knew, would always be unpredictable. But she was ready. She was stronger than ever. And with that, Ajike smiled. Because she had come through the storm, and now, she was ready to live.